when we cherish Paul, which I'd like to think we do every day, but especially here today with Rosalie. And Paul continues to be an incredibly annoying person because he was just too nice and too eloquent for this world, and always somehow made you think, even when he agreed with everything you said, and I always felt that when Paul agreed with everything you said, you were in trouble, and he would agree with everything, and then there would come this next point. So there was always with Paul an interest to pull you towards the next point. And he was interested in buildings that would have the same quality too, that they, just when you thought you understood them, you would be called forward. Somewhere, all of these little gestures of pulling you forward, somewhere along the line was some very, very deep loyalty to the idea of the public good. That would be somewhere there, that you were, and if all of us were being pulled in little ways at little times, all the directions of those little pulls would all come to some sort of common point. And I suppose the public good is always exactly that, a kind of mirage. But if we would all imagine that it was in a certain place in front of us, we would then all arrive at that place more or less at the same time, and it would then have happened, this public good thing. So I think this was Paul's way, and in the same way that a hammer thinks that everything it sees is a nail, I think that Paul saw everybody as another candidate for one more move in the direction, and I was one of those people that was being pulled, of course. So I think it's very annoying that he continues to do this, but he did it, of course, so terribly sweetly. And of course, if it would be possible that architecture could not only pull us like that, but that architecture could be like Paul, like very beautiful in every possible way, that would be a really good thing for architecture, it seems to me. So on this night, we continued to cherish this annoying teacher, and basically, in a way, present him with another architect to prove that all is not lost, and that there are wonderful things being done by architects who feel and act in the same way that he always did. So, in that sense, it's very, very wonderful to be able to welcome Anne to the school, and all of us know the work and want to know more about it. So it's just a great moment to hear more about it, and especially on this evening, because in a way you have done work for universities and cultural organizations and public institutions and the private sphere and so on, a very, very wide spectrum, winning all sorts of awards and status, none of which should matter in a school of architecture, in which every student, in a way, dreams of going beyond any current system for giving awards, or imagine some whole new kind of award that would be necessary for their work. And we may have to invent such an award for Anne, and it would have something to do with Paul, because in this work there's a kind of relentless modernity. It's very clear, but equally clear is its sensitivity to history. So it has built into it exactly this kind of blurring of looking forward and looking backwards that was Paul's sort of trademark. I would like to think that, or imagine that one of Paul's points was that there is nothing more contemporary than history. If you really want to be with it, like tuned in to the current situation, you will start speaking historically, that you can't tune into the present without thinking of the past, or to say it another way, that the way you listen to the past is how you are in the world. But also, to go a little bit further, the way you listen to the past actually even orients you, because if I put my ear to the past, I put my body in a certain position, and I find myself looking forward. So the gesture of looking or listening to the past is also a particular way of aiming yourself towards the future. And so in a work of architecture, that means this reflection on the past and this using of the past to launch yourself forward. In this school, this is a kind of mandate where the school is founded on the great archive of Avery Library in the basement, and then has the great laboratories for the future in the attic, and the relationship between the attic and the basement is the secret engine of the school. So again, the whole school is sort of like this, according to what I was saying to you sort of explains why we're a bit crazy, this whole angled position. But getting back to Ann Beha's work, sometimes this is it seems to me very obvious, like maybe the kind of commission to think through the renovation of the Walter Gropius U.S. Embassy in Greece and so on. In other words, situations that are sort of evidently historical and call on the craft of an architect who's tuned to the strange intimacy of the past and the future. But I think even more interesting for me, and I think we'll probably see it in the work tonight, is that there are many projects in which actually the historical context is not so clear, and what the work does is make that clear. So in other words, instead of being commissioned to make a work in a historic context, these are buildings that, as it were, expose an unseen historic context, so they actually render a situation historical that might not have been seen that way. And maybe the work of this office is sort of divided between those moments where you're called into an obviously historical situation and you act in a contemporary way, and those situations that seem contemporary, and you actually give, as a kind of a gift, sensitivity to the historical complexity. So for all of these reasons, it's really a great pleasure to welcome Ann to the school, and do so for Paul, and always for Paul, and always for Paul. Ann.
I'm very honored to speak in memory of Paul and recall him as such a gentleman, so devoted to his city, so devoted to his students, such a shaper of the place this has become. And I also am very honored to have such a distinguished audience. By that I mean all the students. You are the future, and you'll make it, and you will make it because of people like Paul Byard. There is a third thank you, which is to Gavin Browning, who organizes these amazing lecture series at Columbia. And he was kind enough to call me, and in a moment of weakness, I said, I'd be thrilled. And I really appreciate everything he and Annie and the AV booth are doing to help me out. Gavin said we needed to give a name to ourselves. And I gave the name Welder because I feel, it just came to me. And I said, well, a welder is somebody who better damn well know what he's doing or she's doing. You do not want to have a bad welder on your job because it's going to be there for a long time. A welder is a person who puts things together that are supposed to support all that comes next. And it's an aspirational name, not a real name. But if I could look at the work we try to do, it's to create moments of change that have a firmament that is strong and that is reasonable and that is based on research as well as intelligence and a kind of care and listening. And I think that's the search that we all have. So the first thing to acknowledge in talking about who I am is that if I'm a welder, my structure is in front of you. And this is my office in Boston. It is a different zip code, but very close to New York. And the people you see in this picture are the people who make everything I'll talk about tonight happen. And it is impossible to imagine 35 more talented individuals contributing to our community in our studio. The thing I want to talk about as I start is where I feel design growth comes from. We can look at other architects, we can look at our historic analyses, we can look at so much information, but there are times at which I've been blessed enough to look beyond the norm. And 3,000 miles from New York City is Marfa, Texas. And Marfa, Texas is where Donald Judd threw his 3 kids into his car and drove to, a 32-hour drive, to find a place where he could put his work. And he used architecture as a vehicle for explaining who he was as an artist. And when I went to Marfa, and if you fly to Marfa, you go to El Paso, and then you put cruise control on, and you drive for 200 miles on cruise control. If you go to Marfa, you really are making a pilgrimage, and you find what was once a cavalry fort defending the border between Texas and Mexico of several hundred buildings, shed buildings, in which about 600 soldiers lived. The fort was built in 1911. It was active right up until the mid part of the 20th century. And Judd was looking for his conceptual art for an architecture that supported a sense of place aligned with a sense of art. And he did not think American museums in the 1970s could do it. And he was probably absolutely right. So he found Marfa, and Judd at Marfa was a man who has, I think, since I've been there, provided this kind of fundamental inspiration to me about how non-architects view preservation and how preservation informs art, and how some artists feel, as Judd did, that the, gosh, he's dark, that you cannot divorce the placement of art from the context of architecture. So Judd found this place. He was supported by the Dia Foundation. I understand you recently had speakers from Dia, and they will tell you that he took over these sheds and he began to build his art in this barren, endless, relentless heat and cold and wind of Texas. And when you see it, you realize that nothing you've done to work for a client is so profound as that which was simply the given instinct of an artist to recycle buildings, repurpose them, take care of them, and somehow find in their history a place for his history. He built new sheds on the ranch. He placed in them hundreds of his stainless steel boxes, each of which sits on this polished concrete floor in direct relationship to the Texas desert. The experience of being there was never expected to be spiritual. Judd was unbelievably pragmatic. He had been in the Army, and when he was in the Army, they put him in charge of facilities. When he got in charge of facilities in the Army, he decided maybe he should be an architect. Instead, he became a sculptor. But this sense of alignment between art and architecture never left him, and it's seen in all of the spaces and in everything he did. And then he teamed up with his friends, Dan Flavin being one, who also had unusual work that involved neon and fluorescent lamps, and created these environments inside the barracks buildings and inside the other buildings that are completely mysterious, very unsettling, hard to inhabit, and you never forget them. And he brought in Carl Andre. You're seeing here one of the barracks buildings with the high windows and the wood ceiling, and he brought in John Chamberlain, and he placed his ilk in this place and set it up that the landforms that he was building on the site and the heritage he was creating became part of an absolutely unique environment. And what I would say about being at Marfa and being in the presence of someone who wrote about the alliance between architecture and art is that you cannot imagine how pragmatic and visionary and poetic it is all at the same time. So when you go as an architect, you say, what am I thinking? You know, it needs to come from somewhere in the gut as well as somewhere in the head. It needs to come from a certainty that the way we touch the land and the way we touch that historic site would somehow make this marriage that no one could believe in. No one could think it. And I think that's the same thing of one other place in Texas. I'm boosting Texas. The Chamber of Commerce is going to love this. To go to another place in Houston and see the work of a completely different artist who uses architecture in a completely different way. And that's James Turrell. And I have worked with James Turrell on installations, and his sense of architecture and his sense of the way in which one touches the land is certainly an object lesson in progress and inspiration for architectural design. So here you see the basic Google map of the Rice campus, and their big music building is right here. And their other buildings are very conventional and very appealing and traditional. and Terrell's building or object is right here. And Terrell decided he would build a pavilion for music. So this hovering hood or kind of slice sits on top of a plinth of green grass, and you can walk through it. It's on the direct walk path that goes from the biggest parking lot I've ever seen through to the center of the campus, and people inhabit it on a daily basis. And because of the way it works with LED lighting and the Texas sky, it changes constantly in the space. It frames a kind of inhabitation. And you see not only these extraordinary colors, but music is played inside this shed. And music performance and acoustics were on Terrell's mind when he created it. So it's not just a sculpture, it's actually a public and civic space of the kind that you can't imagine on many campuses throughout the country. And the light and the inhabitation and the people are so engaged in this really very, very small thing. So in two parts of a very big state, you have a sprawling installation of someone who really never knew what a building permit and renovation and working with a general contractor was all about. That would be Donald Judd. I can't imagine him having the patience for that. And Terrell, whose name now is so incredibly popular, but at the time he's doing this work, is trying to touch the land lightly in a very spiritual sense. So why show this? You know, you can have a lecture where you just show your work all the time. Show your work, show your work, show your work. And it's tempting, but it really doesn't seem to serve the sense of what we're trying to do, to remember Paul and to think also about where architecture and space and history is going. We need to look beyond ourselves, beyond our New York zip codes and our Boston traditions, and we need to look at the work other people are doing and the way they're thinking about their land and the way they're touching the space around them. And I think that I'm trying to say that you learn so much when you're not thinking about yourself, but you're thinking about everyone who does it better and more clearly and somehow with a greater sense of poetry. So my theme in my life is that I'm always looking. Maybe I'm a born shopper, but I am always looking. And I'm trying to look as broadly as I can at the issues in front of me and the issues in front of our studio. And I'm trying to find a way to navigate these balances between history, personal stories, design intention, design quality, budget, the building code, all of these different burdens and opportunities. So I want to come now to another person who is a very full name, Electra Havemeyer-Webb, who lived in Vermont during the summers and decided that with her resources, she would build a house in the in the Champlain Valley in Vermont, and she would, while doing that, touch the land in ways that are very unique and collect 150,000 objects. Dollhouses, hat boxes, decoys, boats, buildings, and that she would amalgamate these in a unique environment of some 50 acres on Route 7 in Vermont, a major sort of drag up near Burlington. And she would open these collections to the public, installing all the objects of Americana in the buildings, making a tour between the buildings, but not really providing a lot of interpretation, just allowing them to exist and inviting the public to connect with them at whatever level the stories would tell. And needless to say, the Shelburne Museum had not built a building in a long time. Mrs. Webb died in the 60s, and they are a seasonal museum, so when they invited architects to propose services to them, their goal was to create a year-round facility for the first time and to become somehow more embedded in their community rather than seasonal. So you see here their whole site, and all of these little dots are Electra's, I probably should call her Mrs. Webb's, buildings, churches, post offices, barns, front porch buildings, back porch buildings, riding rings, circus over here, trains, just this cornucopia of material culture. And then, of course, the biggest element of all, the parking lot, and the entry, and then the route through the site. So this is Route 7 in Vermont. It goes up to Burlington, and this is the kind of fabric of the site. And to think about a new building on this site was very challenging, and the idea of it would be that it would be a building that somehow would announce Shelburne. It would announce it without the need for a sign, but at the same time it would try to mitigate or manage these period buildings and the 21st century. So it was to be a building that was of the fabric of Shelburne, but also establishing a new identity for Shelburne. And I think that if you look at the work of our office, it's constantly about institutions undergoing change, sometimes profound change, and usually about their attempts to become more civic, more relevant, and more accessible. So the site is really a piece that's right here along Route 7, and you see it here. And I just want to plainly and simply tell you that we spent months working on where this building would be. And you're going to see now a sequence of how it moved, and with each 4 committee meetings to discuss the various options. So this building was wrought by many, many hands and over a very long period of time. And finally, it nestled in right next to the round barn, which is up on the screen here, and the entry building here on a little area that was on the path, and we changed some paths, and then finally related to a larger concept about what would happen with roads and adjacent buildings, access, and this kind of arc of garden and planting and horticulture that surrounded in here so that it could sit appropriately in the site. So the building then was modeled, and the discussion constantly is, why shouldn't it look like a Vermont barn? It's got the scale of a Vermont barn, and it has the idea of galleries in it, which are large-scaled, and so a Vermont barn seems like the right building to build. Well, Mrs. Webb had collected barns. These were period barns, and they were from the 18th and 19th century from all over New England, and there's no way that a barn built in the 21st century was ever going to compete with the real McCoy. And there was a moment where we just said, well, you've already done it better than anybody else could do it. So the barn conversation just got handled because it's the truth. They had already done true barns and true large-scale buildings that really were rooted in the agricultural traditions. So we started to look instead at something that was scaled more like their buildings and broken into parts. And from there, we started to look at this idea of cranking the building, moving it around, and trying to get its scale and its massing related to the domestic scale buildings and some of the larger agricultural buildings that were on the site. And the result is this 2-story building, but the lower portion is largely bermed into the topography. So from a sustainability point of view, it has this kind of natural performance because it is so embedded in the land. And you see here this very simple layout of the building. It has a long porch looking into the site, into the rest of the museum site, and then it has galleries, which are the sort of left-hand buff color, and green is a large meeting space. This is a very simple building. But its idea is that it's accessible year-round and that it speaks to the activity and the kind of commitment that Shelburne Museum has always had to its community, but wants to be more visible about. And then the question was, well, what shall it be clad in? And Shelburne has every kind of building on its site, wood, brick, stone, so the sky's the limit, essentially. But with the sustainability issues also very much in play and the Vermont traditions, we looked at quite a few things that might seem to be worth exploring. So we were next to the round barn, just across from it, and we started to look at different ways to play with patterning and shingling and siding that was rough and more similar to agricultural buildings. We looked at directly using more stained siding and a kind of cleaner line from a more modern point of view. And we've also looked at a great deal of stone, since stone is quite common in that part of Vermont, and finally at the kind of trim and glass systems that would belong in a building like this. So our idea was to keep the palette just as simple as possible, not to get too carried away with too many materials, And from there, we got into the idea that it would be a very simple kind of cedar siding, very lightly stained and preserved, hewn, not grown locally so much as finished locally, and that on it would rest on a base of local New York State stone that is its foundation and runs around the building. And the columns are very simple timber on the front, but the siding starts to play in different ways, horizontally and vertically, depending on where the building faces and how the sun moves around the site, how people see it from different angles. So you're seeing now some of the renderings that were much discussed, because building these kinds of buildings is an act of tremendous public consensus building. One's building consensus with board, with donors, with all kinds of staff members, and at the same time with the community at large. I don't think there's a single project we're doing which doesn't have a strong community-based consensus as well as a strong governance-based consensus. And it turns out that architecture is like restaurants. Everyone has an opinion. So it's a constant dialogue and navigation to try to both hear people and respect what they're saying, and also to kind of fearlessly barge ahead with something they may not have been thinking about. So this does come after many months of those kinds of very exciting and energetic discussions. And here is the building being constructed. I put in quite a few construction pictures because I think it's always important to talk about the act of building, not just the product at the end. And you can see a little bit of the round barn over the top of this. So when the steel went up, we also had a lot of walls done so that we could see how the stone would be arrayed. This one was roundly rejected at the base, but we finally worked out how the stone would be put together, how the siding would be put together. And I think the building is really extremely simple, and I like that about it. It is definitely, these are very fresh photos from last September, it's definitely built into the land. It is already very actively used. It opened in late August, opens onto the landscape. And, really the question, and we tried to frame views of other things. You see the Ticonderoga, their boat here on the left. I think we were really trying to create a pavilion that brought attention to itself, but got you out of it, moving into the rest of the site as much as it could as well, that it was an open door to the rest of the site, not just a place you went to spend the day. So the views are very carefully framed, and the materials, Vermont slate, of course, the siding, find their way into the interiors so that the relationship between inside and outside is carefully considered. So right now it is a place which holds a lot of exhibitions of new materials as well as Mrs. Webb's folk art, and it's having its first year of activity. It's hugely popular, which is great, and they're able to get so much of her collection out and interpreted in ways that they couldn't before, and that's very satisfying. By the way, the floor is beech that was harvested locally in Vermont and also finished by a fabricator within miles of Shelburne. This is a contemporary artist who's just had an installation there of glass fiber. And of course, it's a place for families. I think the biggest change is the way in which the site occurs along Route 7 to the public. This is the way Shelburne looked before. This is how you knew you were at Shelburne, is that you saw a white picket fence and then ultimately a sign. And this is the way it looks now. Several buildings were moved. A lot of the site was opened up. The parking, areas of the parking were redone. One thing leads to another. And the result is not just a building, but a whole precinct of the campus, of the museum campus, that's simply reconsidered and replanned and, also balanced against what the resources are that are available for the project. And I think the reason we take pictures at night sometimes is because they're dramatic, but largely because nightfall in Vermont happens around lunchtime. And, we are north, ladies and gentlemen. So, how this building looks in the winter and at night is incredibly important. That is when people in the community want the building to be open and need the building to be open to give them another cultural anchor in their community. So it was very important to us to be able to illuminate it at night and draw some warmth to it in the cold Vermont winter. So I'm going to go from a completely different story of Mrs. Webb and her legacy at Shelburne to Chicago. And I'm going to talk about a different kind of place, because talking about economics at Chicago is amazing. And in some ways, the idea of economics and a new place for economics at the University of Chicago is never the idea of a single person, the way Mrs. Webb or James Turrell or Donald Judd would have been a single thinker. But it always takes someone with real guts and imagination to think about disrupting 150 faculty, some of whom have spent time in Sweden getting medals, 100 PhD students, since Chicago, Freudian slip, does not give masters in economics, because if you need a master's, go somewhere else. And telling them that they're going to move to a former theological seminary. And that is what the University of Chicago is doing. They have acquired and are repurposing the former Chicago Theological Seminary. And I'm going to talk about this project in a little more detail than Shelburne, because it is a very unique example of a university where stewardship and design and invention are all coming together on one campus. And this takes people with very strong leadership and vision for their university. So here's the Chicago Theological Seminary, just in the front, of course, with its amazing carillon. It was built in the early part of the 20th century, and the historic photographs of it tell you all that is needed. It's a place of contemplation. It was educating ministers. It has always been a backbone of the Protestant faith. And over time, the theological seminary decamped to another building. They became smaller. They changed their approach. They have a different kind of inclusiveness about world religions. And this building, which is so steeped in a certain kind of theological tradition, became a less familiar ground for their intentions. The University of Chicago is right next to this. This sits right at the edge of their campus. It's adjacent to the Roby House and also across the street from Raphael Vignoli's Booth School of Business. So designing something here, of course, is no pressure. The building has a couple of stories. It's not a building that was ever connected. One side was a dorm, the other side were the worship spaces and the preaching spaces. And the idea of moving this whole community of economists in here with their graduate students and making it a space that encouraged cross-disciplinary study and research was put on the table as the goal. And so in terms of understanding the building, this is like understanding Hogwarts times 10. There are nooks and crannies and spaces and complexities and heritage items and light fixtures and stained glass windows and nursery school next door with these small buildings, so construction is a whole nother piece. But it's set within a neighborhood of very active advocates for preservation, and of course the neighborhood is also very wary about changes to its physical environment. It also is typically Chicagoan in that it's serviced through an alley system. The alleys come through these sites all over the city, and the backyards are used as ways for fire trucks to get through. They're city alleys, and they have backyards associated with lots of townhouse buildings. Many of the buildings were owned by the University of Chicago, but when we saw the back of this site, we went, wow, here's an opportunity. You know, you always want to go where there's trouble. So here is the entry to this, and one of the first challenges was to get an idea of a unified building, because when you're building for a large community of changing students, you always want to think that your building will provide that kind of transferable collaboration and cross-disciplinary activity that, you know, that every university so aspires to. So right now, we are unifying the building. We went through a process with the city of Chicago, getting the street turned out earlier, and we've been able to close off the street so that the entry is right in the truck portal, and we've built a spine and stair that connect all of the levels. So the first design intention was the unification of this very large structure. Right now, if you go out there, you'll see more snow than this, but this is the construction of the space. It has two levels. One is the entry level, which will be up here at the limestone belt course. That will be where we enter. And the other is looking through a large new conference room that will be built up into the upper portion of this huge arch, looking back towards the neighborhood back area, as well as out towards the whole Rockefeller Chapel part of this gorgeous campus. The excavation here is deliberate. It is to support some things I'll talk about in a minute, but the installation of the hood and the way in which it's related to the limestone has been a work of art in itself, and our design team has really been fantastic on these kinds of details where we're touching history and at the same time trying to install something specifically contemporary. So right now you can see this is the mock-up for the installation of the piece that will go into that entry. Everything is mocked up and checked. This will be a type of steel that has a slight burnished color to it, very distinct from the palette of the existing building. And the excavation supports two notions that are critical to the project. The first is that all in gray is the mechanical system. These are the driving forces of some projects because the Chicago Theological Seminary never was air-conditioned, was badly heated, and in no way could people move into this building without a comprehensive new mechanical system. So the excavation, which is about 25 feet deep on the left, supports the mechanical system, and on the right, because the entire program couldn't fit into the building, and those colors represent different aspects of the program, we are building a nearly 100-seat lecture hall below grade under the garden on the right. So that's what the excavation supports. This diagram is a Revit diagram that shows how we are running the systems through the building. So you see here that we've got this piece underground. This is the whole plant. And what we're showing here are the different 5 levels of the building and how we're servicing them with a chilled beam system, which is the best system for this kind of building. And, really state-of-the-art. But the intensity of coordination on this project cannot be underestimated. So here you have the front of the building before construction started, limestone, brick with the stained glass. And this is the excavation that's almost completed now. On the left for the mechanical system, on the right for the large seminar room, and in the middle, of course, the former drive-through. And all of these pieces that are missing at the ground level have been stored and sorted and numbered and are ready to go back in afterwards. There's a garden, a pulpit, all kinds of details. So what I'm saying is that the surveying of existing conditions, the ability to catalog things, the ability to sort through elements of significance and elements that are going to be in the way and how are you going to work with it is an incredible piece of a project like this, just to simply inventory all of the aspects that need to be retained. And this is a view of the below-grade conference room that is built into the garden. And this is the garden with the brick wall now gone that will be constructed over its roof. And you'll see that there is glass going into that seminar room and a way of moving into the entry, which is over here, that now is an easy slope through a new garden at the front. So landscape preservation, urban advocacy, and then design have all come together on this project. And for rooms like this, where the former chapel, Taylor Chapel, the idea here is that it's going to become a graduate commons. It becomes very heavily used by the 100 graduate students. All of the woodwork is maintained. The lighting comes back restored. New lighting is installed at one end. It's going in right now. And the limestone and all of the woodwork is preserved. The room can be like a transformer toy and set up in different ways. It'll be AV'd. It'll have all kinds of connections to the global kind of interface. And this is the room now. It's being cleaned. The organ has come out to be renovated and installed in another chapel at the University of Chicago. And we are now moving into other spaces. This is now the cloister, which is going to be the entrance to the undergraduate offices. And then you have the library, which is not needed for the program. So the library is going to have all of its original wall paneling retained, all of its interior limestone cleaned, and be turned into a tiered seminar room. And all the pieces here that are new are also kind of floating away from the walls. So this is where we were with the library in terms of its condition and grime and just years of steam heating. And this is where we are with the cleaning tests. And this is the analysis of the cleaning tests. BCA, Ray Pepe, and Dorothy Krotzer are doing all this work for us. And you probably know them, and they're amazing. And then this is the room right now. It's ready. As you can see here, the distribution of the heating and ventilating is under this tiered floor so that we didn't have to put any ducts in, and we'll then have all the seating and fixed desk put in there. But the room is starting to really get its mojo back, and it really was exciting. I was there last week looking at it, and it's just wonderful. So this is going ahead, and then finally for the rest of the graduate students, we went up into the attic and saw that you did have head height, you could move around it, but all of the trusses were clad with terracotta block for fireproofing. So with different code compliance strategies, we were able to take the terracotta block off, and this is kind of the IKEA loft for grad students. They'll have lots of movable workstations here. They can be here and collaborate. It's kind of a studio environment, and that's in construction right now. So because we're talking about preservation, I just thought I'd take a minute to talk about a couple of different preservation issues on this building to say that it's impossible as an architect to know all this, but it is also obligatory to know enough about it to yourself be a good client to conservators. So the facility and fluidity or fluency of the language of preservation is really essential to our firm's practice. And when we see a condition like this, we know we have to have experts, but we have to be able to ask the experts the right questions. So one strategy we've used on this building is to actually use some parts of the building that are less significant and needed alterations for chases or piping as the quarry for the new limestone replacements. So we're sort of cannibalizing where appropriate, taking the limestone out, recutting it, and then able to put it in. To avoid things like this, which is what one of the subcontractors originally proposed as a way of dealing with mending bad limestone and recutting things so that we're able to work like this with a new piece of limestone. And again, this is a sort of triage that needs to come along during the planning of the project so that you know that these kinds of repairs, which you see here, are possible, but will also last. Because once a building is renovated, it is not going to be maintained on an ongoing basis aggressively. There are just too many other buildings on a campus like this that are in the way. And then we have the roof and all of the cupola restoration, all the flashing. We have 186 pairs of windows in the building to deal with, all of which were broken in various states of disrepair. Each had to be surveyed, analyzed, and in some cases they were missing. A whole analysis of how new windows would protect but also enhance the building from a thermal point of view had to be undertaken, and mock-ups and analyses showed us if we spent this much money on a window, what we'd get in payback for the investment, this much money, this much money, this much money, cost per window unit, performance on total system cooling load, total system heating load. It's really research, and it's research that needs to be done on building performance, and we're doing it live time on our project and coming up with systems and sometimes materials not made in the United States, so not great for the lead points, but really high performance because they've been manufactured abroad for conditions and under mandates that are more stringent. Finally, coming back to the alley. We looked at the alley and the nursery school moved. So the project became a 3-building project when the nursery schools over here on the left moved. And research teams can be in those buildings once they're restored. So that's going on right now. But in looking at this, we asked ourselves, what kind of condition could we create here where the university's green campus could be extended into this new kind of frontier piece that's on the edge of its perimeter. And we looked at a new building. And this is where the things that Paul cared about really showed up. To scale this building properly, we had to take the leadership about how big it should be. We had to take the advocacy for how it would relate to the row houses. We had to make sure that the community was comfortable with it and that the way it slid in and connected to the historic buildings, both the row houses and the original house and the original building were appropriate. And we have advanced that, trying to find a scale to the new structure that relates to the scale of the townhouses, but also deals with a very robust and demanding population of researchers. So you see here the model for the new building that is at the back of the site, and that is a building 3 stories that has a terracotta rain screen wall and various kinds of high-performance glazing systems on it, and opens into a new green space. So that the long-term plan here will be that all the backyards of the buildings that the university owns will be turned into green space. And they will provide a kind of campus environment in the back that changes dramatically this kind of service alley into something that's really a piece of the campus, but not an impact on the campus, a found opportunity. So on the left you see the new building. At the center of the screen is the Theological Seminary, now the Center for Economics, and this green space here that we've been designing with the leadership of the Olin Partnership from Philadelphia is an entirely new way of dealing with found spaces on the campus. Very exciting. I mean, really taking the dumpster locations and making them part of the campus fabric. And on the front, the same is true. This building sits behind the row houses. It certainly is visible. It's certainly a robust building, but it tries to find its scale within its family. And as part of the final phase, the discussion of landscape became very robust, and we were really thrilled that the university was able to persuade the neighborhood to close off the street or make it a shared street so that only emergency vehicles can go down it, and to move the landscape out from the former edge of landscape all the way into the street, so that we have added 70 new trees and 25,000 square feet more of green space to the front of the campus, places that everybody in the neighborhood can enjoy and is welcome to. So that's the story of Chicago, and it completes the first phase of it, which is the Theological Seminary, completes in about 60 days, and that's very exciting. And you see here the way in which the underground classroom is expressed on the surface with the ramp going up. And then here, the colonnade that is connecting 2 sides of the building that were also unconnected, the center entry, and then some of the other interventions, of course, that I showed you on the north side in the alley. This is institutional leadership at, I think, its finest, both for stewardship, to support modern design, to welcome the neighbors in, to comment, to embrace the cost of some of these things, and to be able to persuade its donors that this kind of heritage matters to the students who attend the school and to the kind of robust intellectual environment and the kind of moral stand that they want their students to take about their communities. And I really give hats off to the university for thinking in this way and being able to bring others along with it. So finally we'll go to Walter Gropius in Athens, and then I'll leave you. Walter Gropius built the U.S. Embassy in Athens in 1958. What a German emigre to the United States was doing in Athens after the Second World War has not been written. He was certainly a brilliant designer, but the whole idea with the history of German occupation of Greece that Gropius got this job is still in my mind an amazing reality. And he was not the first architect they had. The project came to him after the design work by another firm just didn't get traction. So Athens, as you know, is one of the densest cities in this part of the world, and Gropius arrived there to design with a Greek firm a building that would be alone, but of the fabric, completely monumental, and at the same time completely civic. So this is the neighborhood in which he placed his building. And here he is on the left, as they say, lui-même, with a State Department cohort. And he is standing in the completed building, which you can see right here has an enormous set of cypresses in the middle of its courtyard, open-air courtyard, a curtain wall system, 1958, that was steel, and single-glazed, a German-made grill system at the base, which is kind of enameled in a bright blue, and works on the site by a variety of European as well as American sculptors. So here's the building itself. It's the Chancery, which means it's basically the main building of the U.S. Embassy. And the United States State Department has a remarkable program called Design Excellence for Embassy Facilities, or Diplomatic Facilities Abroad, and our firm was just rather recently selected to do this project. So I am not able to tell you what we're doing because we haven't really gotten started yet, but I can tell you what some of the challenges are. And one of them, of course, is that this building was decidedly civic, decidedly open. The renderings show lots of people, and it was intended that way. Lots of stairs going up, all kinds of proximity to the street. And now the way it stands can't be compared with the way it once was positioned along this main street. This is like putting an embassy on Madison Avenue and then having Benghazi to tell you that there really are challenges with placing diplomatic facilities in open areas. So the embassy stands proudly and has been a backdrop for a tremendous number of ceremonial events, which are inspiring. But it is also, right now, engulfed in a security system that is important to the lives and needs of the people who work on the embassy campus. So our project needs to address the safety of people who are within 25 yards of the street in a city which has had a number of incidents in the past on the embassy campus site. And we're just rolling up our sleeves, and we know we've got to deal with the security of the building. This building is listed on the State Department's Cultural Heritage List, one of only a handful of buildings to be in that position. And it has security issues associated with its proximity that are undeniable, because it is the setback for U.S. embassies, for normal embassies, would be somewhere back here. And this building is way out at the edge. So without focusing totally on security, we also are very interested in the building fabric. And just as I was saying for Chicago, it's so important to understand the history of the building, how it's put together, its history of repairs and maintenance, and also what the design opportunities are to work with the fabric or to somehow step away from the fabric and make something clearly different but still in conversation with the fabric. So here you see the facade of the building with its pentelic marble columns. They're enormously tall, most of them very much affected by the kind of pollution and deterioration that you get when you have those kinds of stones used in very urban environments. They have a lot of deterioration. And what we've done so far in thinking about Athens is simply try within the studio to understand how it's put together. That's really the stage we're at. So what we think about it right now, of course, we read as much as we can about what Gropius was trying to do, but we look visually. As I said, we're always looking. And it has a plinth. It has a forest of columns. It has a courtyard. It has glazing and an envelope. It has a significant overhang that's probably not sturdy enough for the kind of resistance it needs to bear. It has beams that need reinforcement. And when all of that work is done for the lives of the people or the work of the people, 100 and some odd people who are in this building, they cannot just decamp to an office building in Greater Athens, because our diplomatic facilities really require that people be in an environment that can be managed under diplomatic constraints. So what they've also asked us to do, other than analyzing the building and getting to a place where we understand it better and how we might intervene with it, is to look at the site, the campus of the entire embassy, which stretches all the way from this park down here to the street, and look at the possibility of a new structure related to and adjacent to the Gropius building, which would be used for expansion and relief during construction. And indeed, in the early 1990s, Coleman, McKinnell, and Wood finished this building for the embassy. It sits next to the Gropius building. It has a large, long garage that's here, a parking structure. And the idea is that somehow the work we do is going to have to bring the whole site, an addition, and the restoration of the Gropius building all together. So we've been looking just at the idea of massing, how many gross square meters you can get on the site, what the relationships would be to the setbacks to the Gropius building, how one might think about the Coleman, McKinnell, and Wood building. They are a very distinguished firm as well, and their work deserves tremendous care, and how we would attach this. So I figured Paul would know what to do. And I just closed because I would say, Athens has some amazing buildings, and Athens has amazing icons, and the American embassy is a privilege to work on, and it's particularly a privilege when you realize that the city has heritage beyond that which any of us could imagine. So as Americans, we need to work on our own facilities to bring them forward to something that the city is truly proud of and that we're all proud of and feel represents the very best of our commitment to our allies. I love thinking about this, and I need to close with two slides. One is that it's not sometimes about being a welder, it's just about rolling up your sleeves. And the other is that don't travel without your trail mix, with apologies to Roz Chast, who was mercilessly photoshopped here. An architect's life is not ever completely straightforward, and it's good to have the bag in your pocket every so often. Thank you so much for letting me speak about this. Questions? Sure. Mark has kindly offered that we have another minute if there are any comments, refutations, questions, or other kinds of things. Maybe everybody would just really like a martini. I would. Can I rationalize anything that seems particularly absurd that you've seen, or try to explain myself? Quit while you're ahead. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay.
Speaking of going back to the Shelburne Museum project.
Yes.
With such a small town like Shelburne and this very large museum right in the center of this village that is known for the history of acquiring historic buildings to reuse them to suit the mission of the museum, were there any inherent challenges or anything that the museum or your firm itself faced with doing a completely new design for an addition for this pavilion to the site?
Well, I think whenever you advocate for something contemporary in an historic setting, there's always a conversation, and those conversations can be very robust. It would be similar in Chicago. In another era, I'm not sure in that particular context that a building with a green roof and a terracotta screen wall and this kind of high-performance glazing system would be the answer. And you can look at different eras. Many of you are such distinguished architects who are in the audience that you know that we've all gone through our own journeys on what the correct response is. And I guess the word correct is probably the killer word. There's no correct. You can't be any more correct than you are correct. And I think it's a shame when people don't debate it. I think it's important that people do debate it. And I guess as I've gotten more experienced in my work, I try not to show my early work so much because I don't think I was having a robust enough debate with myself. Yeah. And I don't know where it'll go. It's been really great to think about these kinds of changes. But I'm sure there are people who are not comfortable with it and think it's funny and an eyesore and why would they do something like that. I'm sure there are. I think change is a very hard thing. It's very hard for people. And, you know, it's emotional. Architecture is very emotional for people when they see it, when they think about it, and when they imagine it. It's full of memory and associative emotion. They get really riled up. But, you know, you have to be reasonably fearless. I mean, you just have to do it because we have to move forward. Anybody else? Please, Jorge.
And thank you for a fabulous lecture.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit about one of the themes that you brought up in your presentation, which had to do with with changing the qualities of existing buildings, like the project in Chicago.
Yeah.
And this project also, which you put on the poster, which you talk so much about the light in this project. And obviously, it's electrical light that you discussed, artificial light, and so much of that has to do with our modernity, with our experience of the modern world, is to live in interiors and be able to light them up at our whim. In the Chicago project, you talk about mechanical upgrades, so changing the experience of heat and cold inside of these environments. And there's a certain expectation of normativity, you know, in our experience of heat and cold today. That we want buildings not to be too cold or too hot, right? And also in terms of lighting. But you seem to be comfortable with pushing some of these things a little bit in your designs. And so I just wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on when you try to have us rediscover a building. You know, a lot of the visual is given, and you can't change that. So you've shown us you've sort of hinted at that there are some other tricks that you're using to have people sort of wake up to the fact that this building has been changed in some way. And so light and temperature might be some of those ways that you're exploring, but I'm wondering whether that is an accurate reading of what you hinted at or not. I mean, does artificial light play a huge role in your adaptive reuse? Does temperature gradients, you talked a lot about the windows and making sure that they're correct. How do you use those elements to reinterpret how people experience and rediscover the historic building?
Well, all the lighting at Chicago is LED and fluorescent. It's got a really low energy. The energy consumption is performing very well on that project. We do, I'll just answer you very simply. We always work with the best lighting designers we can possibly find because we think light makes a difference to people. And it's a human, rather than being an architectural conceit, I would say it's, for me, a human concern that people feel illumination around them, because I think it just gets us with each other. I think it's more of a community issue than it may be a kind of way of featuring architectural elements. I do think that's great, but it's always the first thing that gets dropped from the budget. It's like, oh, I want to floodlight the tower. Like, yeah, right, value engineering. So for me, it's really more about the experience people have in the rooms. And, after all, if you're on a campus, buildings and the way they present themselves are part of your education. Whether anyone talks about them or not, you're absorbing all of the visual and experiential information you're getting from being in them every day. So why not create a building that makes people really engaged with architecture, makes them really engaged with the detail and engaged with what's happening? I went, when we were doing Chicago, the design, I went to sit in on some economics seminars that were being held at the Booth School. And, you know, that for me was a rather alien experience. And what I noticed that Vignoli had done in his building is that he placed everybody at seating so that they could see each other. And these are people from all over the world who come to Chicago to study economics. And it's important because not everybody speaks English as a first language. And so seeing the way their mouth moves helps you understand what they're saying. But more importantly, their exchange of ideas was not just them and the professor, but them and each other, which is how they were going to change the world, was by being together. And I think light, in that case, inevitably light makes a huge difference. So, anybody else? Thank you. Go ahead.
I have a question about methodology. When, for example, you've been selected for the job in Athens, how did you get to know the building? I mean, did you... How did you get to know the building? Did you ask for the original working drawings of Gropius? Did you do research archival? Or what else? I mean,
okay, so the question is about methodology.
Yes.
And leaving Athens, I just say typically, yes, the history of the building, the history of all of its documents, number one. The history of all of its alterations. Sometimes you can only get them by going to the building department. You get all the alterations they've ever filed a permit for. Also, some intrusive investigation to look at subsurface materials and conditions. Research about manufacturing and where things were made and what kind of limestone we're dealing with, what kind of mortar we're dealing with. All of this kind of compiled encyclopedic information needs to be generated at the beginning. And this becomes this kind of resource pool that has to be carried to all the team members. If all of the mechanical engineers, the structural engineers, the lighting designer, all of those people don't know that history, you'll find that when you come together as a team to create a space or to start to change a space, the relevance and the capturing of the information isn't shared information. You know, why not run a beam right in front of a historic opening? Why not, do that? Well, because you don't know that the architect says that's an area of primary significance. So this is a two-step process. One is the amalgamation of the information, and the other is the analysis of the information. But I take the case that in both cases, in both of those things, the architect's communication skills and ability to really mandate the involvement of the whole team across the country usually, and in the case of Athens, across continents, in that information will be essential to their ability to create a coordinated project. So it's a very, very big piece. The research piece on Chicago, nothing we've done in Chicago is not something we've faced elsewhere. Everything is familiar, but you have to treat everything as new at the same time because it always has its own quality. I mean, the lanterns and lighting and stuff, they all have their own story. I think one of the biggest issues in the work that we've been doing is leaving the interpretation, is developing the interpretation so that people who succeed us and work on the buildings have the right documents. That's another piece that, at the end you're so glad to have it over and just have it open that the idea of creating an archive of what you really did is like, who's going to do that? So that's another piece of it. It's sort of a stewardship that has an aftermath. But that methodology is very important. And the judgments that you make about what is important in a building are not judgments that can be personal. They need to be shared with the owner. You need to rationalize them. There's a dialogue, and there's often a lot of pushback because not every idea is a good idea, and not every idea can be afforded. So this again, this sort of triage is tremendously important to the methodology. Does that kind of, yeah. Anybody else? Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to compliment you on the variety of what you have faced, because I think it means that you think about it with great originality.
Thank you.
And great creativity. I mean, to go from Shelburne Village to the Gropius building is a long, I mean, that's really something. So, I mean, it was a fantastic lecture, but
thank you.
Particularly for that reason, I mean, you're not doing the same thing over and over again. You're thinking about it very, very carefully. I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a daughter who was asked when she was 7 whether or not she wanted to be an architect like her mother, and she said, well, I don't like the phone, I don't really like traveling on airplanes, and I really don't like being mad at everybody all the time. And, you know, so there's the understory of this is that, you know, this is a profession that is a fantastic profession. It has a huge amount of room for talent and originality, and I just am constantly in awe by the kind of originality and fearlessness that are shown by architects around the world, around shaping their environment. And that bag, it's gone from the screen, but, you know, it has its moments. And the idea of the different types of buildings, Adele, that's been such a total treat to have somebody ask you to do something you've never done before. That's just a total treat. But you don't sleep a hell of a lot. I mean, it's a little hairy. So anyway, I'm leaving it all to you.
So I think, I mean, Adele said very beautifully why it was such a wonderful lecture, and why anybody who asks you to make a building for them is going to be very lucky.
Thank you.
But you did remind me of something else, which is that architects don't smile.
Have I been like frowning the whole time?
No. I did a study once to demonstrate that architects are almost never smiling, because for various reasons. But there are exceptions, and so the beautiful, the great humor of your life and your work and your smile, even now, was also something we remember of Paul. So I think I like this evening very, very much, and you have really brought again to light in this room why we continue to love Paul, and you equally.
Thank you very much, everybody.